Hey, hey, you're here. I got your message, and I hear you. You want a little bit more about Maryland and the 17th Amendment, and I'm here for you. Maryland rejected the 17th Amendment. Rather, they didn't reject it. They um, took no action, which is what all the states that are gray or light blue did. They refused to do anything to support it. And you may notice where those states are. It was the South that was most against the popular vote for senators, fearing this reform, like so many others, could weaken white supremacy. The outliers here were Tennessee and North Carolina, which did ratify it. Maryland did ratify the amendment, though, in 2012. So getting on board there. Remember, once 3/4 of the states ratify it, it doesn't technically matter when the other quarter of the states ratify it, but symbolically, it means that the state is saying that it supports that change. Now, Governor Goldsboro, the new Republican governor, was a reformer. Reform was hot in Maryland and around the country in this period, in the first and second decade of the 1900s. Reform, promising reform, helped get people elected, and delivering on reform helped get people reelected. And in Maryland, the Republicans, who controlled the General Assembly too, passed a whole series of reforms in this period. This page over here is from one page of the 1913 General Assembly, 1912 rather, with just all the laws passed, an asylum for the feeble-minded. The language has changed. This would be developmentally disabled today, mentally ill. It wouldn't be segregated today. The hospital for the Negro insane, the House of Reformation, colored, note the different language, the Maryland Hospital for the insane, the white insane implicit there, the Industrial School for Girls, the Maryland School for the Blind, colored, the Maryland School for Boys, and on and on. This is one page going alphabetically in 1 year. There were additional changes to the laws for primaries to select candidates. There were now Maryland state laws against child labor. The 10-hour workday for women, not for everybody. Laws to try to crack down on the criminal violations in oystering which were taking place, which we'll get to in part 2 of this lecture in more detail. There was prison reform, tax reform, in a way that was sold as making taxes more fair. That's the way that tax reform is always sold, and then people argue about whether that reform is more fair or not. There were laws for workers' compensation, all kinds of stuff getting done. And we'll come back to the politics in the next lecture. But we're turning here in the last part of part 1 to lynching in Maryland. And we're going to start by getting a sense of lynching in the United States. So this is a catalog of lynchings of black people in the United States from 1882 to 1968. That timing is a little bit selective. There are lots of lynchings before 1882, but this map gives you a sense of the geographical distribution. So don't take these numbers as rock solid in each case. The Maryland number, for example, is not correct, but rather as impressionistic for where in the country black people might get lynched. And note that Mississippi led the way with 539 lynchings across this period, Georgia with close to 500, and then several states with 200, 300, North Carolina 86, 142 out in Kentucky, 69 out in Missouri, 83 in Virginia, 28 in West Virginia, and again, the Maryland number is wrong, but compare the Maryland number then to the numbers above Maryland. So we go up the East Coast, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. Do you know what I just said in binary? If you speak binary, it was so funny. So lots of zeros and ones. A little more out in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, but across the West, very little. Part of this is explained by the fact that there were relatively few black people out west, although there were more than most people think. But again, this gives you a sense of what it looked like. And as I mentioned earlier, lynching was at its peak in the last 20 years of the 1800s, and this catalog from an anti-lynching activist gives you the numbers that she found going year by year. And note, some years more than 200 in a single year. Each one of these were murders done in public, outside the law, often with the collusion and cooperation of local and state officials in the police, in the courts, in local government, with the collusion and cooperation of newspapers, railroad companies, steamboat companies, and on and on and on. Most of the time, white Southerners defended lynching by claiming that lynchings happened when black men assaulted or raped white women. That lynching, they said, was a defense of white womanhood. That rhetorical posturing, while factually incorrect, the catalog, just a note on the factual incorrectness, the cataloging of lynchings that white people gave the reasons for shows that nowhere near the majority of them were about alleged rapes. They were about all sorts of things. Sometimes rape. But more often, other things. That rhetorical defense of lynching, that it was about defending white women from dangerous rapists, made criticizing lynching difficult for people at the time for a very long time. It was difficult for quite a while even for black leaders to be vocal in their criticism of lynchings, because then the white press and the white politicians could frame you, the black person criticizing lynching, as someone who was pro-rapist, because you're saying that people shouldn't lynch rapists, even though, again, factually, lynching was usually not about rape. In Maryland, lynchings happened again and again. The listing you see over at the left is close to accurate, I think. It is missing a few white people who were lynched and a few black people who were lynched about whom we don't know much at all. The catalog you see there is from the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, as is this map. This map, however, is from a project from the Baltimore Sun, and both are attempts to give you a geographical look at where lynchings took place. As I go through this story, obviously it should be difficult. These are terrible crimes that were committed outside the law. But I believe it's important to tell their stories and say their names, and to recognize the importance of living in a society based on law, where courts issue judgments and penalties, and that those penalties are carried out through a legal system, and not by mobs of people who want to grab someone and hang them and torture them in public. So, with that in mind, I'm not going to touch on every story here, and some I'm just going to do very, very quickly, and some we're going to spend a little more time on. All right. Buckle up. Before the Civil War, before freedom in Maryland, let's put it that way, there were just a handful of lynchings, and every one of them involved free black people. There were no lynchings of slaves. Slaves faced all sorts of other brutality, violence, torture, and abuse, but they were protected from the illegality of lynching because they were property. Most of the time, and apparently in Maryland. In 1850, and hey, just a note here, for like test purposes, you don't need the names and details of all the stories. I'm going to do several of them very quickly, and then there's some that I have slides about and I'll spend more minutes on. Those are the ones where you should have at least a general sense of the story, and you should have a broad sense of the commonality of the stories that I run through. Okay, with that in mind. In 1854, David Thomas, Caroline County, a free black man, was convicted of killing a white man and got sentenced in the court to 16 years, and not the death penalty, which was what the white community wanted back in the charged political climate of the 1850s. So a mob tied up the sheriff, took David Thomas, and hung him. A grand jury said they were unable to identify anybody clearly enough to be able to get a conviction, so nobody was charged. Frederick Pierce was lynched in 1861 in Cecil County. In 1862, Jim Wilson, a free black man, was suspected of murdering an 8-year-old white girl. No trial was ever held. He was held by the sheriff when a mob of 300 people assembled, and the sheriff gave Jim Wilson up. The mob took Jim Wilson, hung him, then cut him, and, according to the press, carved him as though he were a beef, and then roasted to ashes the pieces of him. There was no grand jury, no charges were brought. John Fields, lynched in 1863 in Queen Anne's County. In 1867, not listed in the list here, because this is a listing of the black people lynched in Maryland. But I think it's important to also say the names of the white people who faced lynchings, because I would suggest that this is the terror of a lynching, that if one group is vulnerable to a lynching, then anybody is vulnerable to a lynching. In 1867, James Pippin in Queen Anne's County, a white man with an accomplice who may have been a black man, was convicted of murdering a merchant. The accomplice was found guilty. Sorry, I said this in the wrong way. He and his accomplice were accused of murdering a merchant. The accomplice was found guilty, and James Pippin was acquitted. A mob of 20 or so people found him and hung him from an oak tree.